Okay, so when we're talking about the Gilded Age, we really should be thinking about two different aspects. There's the political aspect of the Gilded Age, and then also the foreign policy aspect of the Gilded Age. And remember that when we're talking about the Gilded Age, we're using a term that's going to be coined by the author Mark Twain, essentially referencing the fact that although it looks pretty and it looks shiny, underneath is dirty and um, you know, things are not as they seem. Things are maybe not as prosperous as they seem. So it's in that political and social context that we want to shift gears a little bit and bring in imperialism. What is the United States doing in terms of foreign policy? I also want to remind you about this frontier thesis. This idea that the American frontier is central to this American identity of individualism, right? That Frederick Jackson Turner's frontier thesis. So if we think about that, what happens then when the frontier closes? And we pose that question, do Americans potentially then look to other nations? Do we look overseas to further that quest for expansion? This idea of I'm going to go explore the unknown, right? At least the unknown to me. I'm going to go explore this unknown. I'm going to go Americanize. I'm going to go bring democracy, bring liberty, bring these ideals that I have. Well, if the West is close to you, then where do you go? Also, keep in mind, this is a time period, if you took maybe AP Euro or if you just remember from world history, when a lot of countries overseas are doing this. As a matter of fact, when we're bringing this in, we are in U.S. history, we're a little bit behind European nations and even Asian nations in terms of using the term colony, right? Talking about colonization. So that is a factor as well. Are we sort of trying to keep up with the Joneses here about our place in the world? And we're deciding, do we want to be isolationists or do we want to be engaged in what's going on in the world and compete in terms of foreign policy with Western Europe? Let's see, there was one more thing I wanted to mention and throw out there, but it's escaping me now. So I'm sure it will come to me as we go and I will mention it. Okay, this is a great political cartoon. I've blown it up, so it's a little bit blurry. Where it's Uncle Sam here. He's smoking his cigar. He's leaned back. He's got the globe on his lap, and he has these little American flag pins. And he's saying, "By gum, I rather like your looks." And he's looking at the world, right? So he's sort of staking a claim. Oh, I think this is what I wanted to mention. The idea of the word colony, colonizer, colonies in American history, I think is not a non-controversial term. Americans we don't like to see ourselves as colonizers. We are liberators. We bring freedom, right? We don't colonize. We were a colony. We said that was wrong. We broke away. We allow others to control their own destinies. But of course, we know that the reality is in U.S. history that that's not necessarily an accurate portrayal of how we have behaved in terms of our foreign policy, especially in the late 1800s, early 1900s. But even before that, every time we add territories, we are colonizing, right? Manifest Destiny at its heart is a colonization effort. Every time we are gobbling up land from Mexico, even the Gadsden Purchase, right? Why do we have Hawaii? That's what we're going to be talking about. All of these, do they make us colonizers or do they simply make us expansionists? That's definitely a word that we're more comfortable with, right? So just some tension there between who we are as an idealized version of America and what our actions have been, and then how do we sort of historically and even today grapple with and reconcile those two maybe competing sides of our identity. Okay, so we have just some maps here so that when we're referencing places, you can sort of have an idea of what we're talking about. On the left, you have Central America, and on the right, you have South America. And then this is Hawaii, essentially, right there in the middle. The big black thick square is highlighting Hawaii for you. And then farther to the west, you have the Philippines being highlighted. And then down there in the middle, To the south, you have American Samoa. So we are also very strategically going after islands in the Pacific. I want you to think, I use the word strategically, but I want you to think about strategy here. If we want to engage or further our trade alliance or our trade experience with East Asia, why might these islands in the Pacific be important to that goal? So what is imperialism? Well, imperialism is just the policy by which strong nations extend their political, military, and economic control over weaker nations. Why does the United States, why does America shift attention overseas? Well, we had an experience with Native Americans, our treatment of Native Americans, our colonization of Native American land, and it provided an experience of colonial control. We sort of knew or learned how to do this, what to do with Native people when we encountered them. We have a lot of trial and error in the United States with the Native American groups, and so we're going to think that then we can bring this American experience of colonization out of just the mainland United States and maybe expand it overseas. I mentioned at the jump here the closing of the frontier leading to fears not just about natural resources, but about this outlet for American identity. There's an economic crisis. We talked about the Panic of 1873. And that is going to lead a lot of businessmen to look to overseas markets. And once you start to expand economically, it makes sense that you want to protect that economic advancement and maybe expand politically, maybe expand militarily, maybe all of the above. But I also want to mention there are different types of imperialism. You can have military imperialism, political imperialism, for sure. Those are what sort of come to mind when we talk about imperialism. But you can also have economic imperialism, where you technically don't control a particular territory or nation, but you are so economically in control that you are sort of the de facto colonizer there. Social unrest led many to see expansion as an outlet for frustration. This idea that Americans need an outlet for expansion, almost like we need an outlet for violence in a lot of ways. When we talk about the Spanish-American War, I'll bring this up again. There are also fears about being left behind. We're going to read a poem called The White Man's Burden by Rudyard Kipling, who's the author of the Jungle Book. He might be familiar to you guys. And it is this poem in which Kipling is challenging the United States to take up what he calls in the poem the white man's burden, that you're not a kid anymore. He says, put down your childish ways. Essentially, America is a teenager now, and it needs to start playing a role on the world stage. And there are a lot of heathen people out there, he says, to colonize, a lot of people who need to understand Christianity, a lot of people who don't understand how to have proper governments. And so he is calling on the United States to enter the ring of imperialist control. And social Darwinism, right? Remember, social Darwinism is the application of Darwinist theories of evolution, things like survival of the fittest, to society. So if America has strength, right, does might make right? And in this argument, yes, it does. So if the United States can subjugate others, it should subjugate others. The United States is strong, the United States is wealthy, so the United States should expand at the expense of those who are not strong, who are not wealthy. It is the way of the world. Survival of the fittest applied on a political scale. And then there is also a book that's going to be written by a naval commander named Alfred Mahan. And Alfred Mahan writes The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. And he essentially says in this text that becomes extremely influential, that if the United States wants to be a power to be reckoned with, then we need to establish a strong navy. That all of the major powers of the world historically had a strong navy, and that we need to sort of get on that, he would say, get on that building up of our naval superiority. You really don't build up a strong navy and then not use it, so we'll see that play out. And this is a great little chart here that's going to tell you about American imperialism. If you look at the center circle there where it says American imperialism and then look to the right, you have motives for imperialism. You have what exactly is the American colonial empire. It talks about the empire in the Caribbean and also the empire in the Pacific. Then we have U.S. foreign policy between 1898 and 1914. They're going to talk about East Asia and Latin America, more information about the Spanish-American War. And they also mention, which we will get to, I promise, they also mention anti-imperialists. Anti-imperialists oppose economic expansion or imperialist expansion for several reasons. Here they mention they see it as anti-democratic, right? How can you be so hypocritical as to be fighting against the idea of colonialism, right? And then here you are establishing colonies. But we'll get into more of the nuance of their argument in a bit. So some events here as we shift our attention overseas. In 1867, the Secretary of State, a man named William Seward, purchases Alaska from Russia for about $7.2 million. So here we are expanding. In 1895, U.S. businessmen begin to invest in Latin America, which simply means they're buying large tracts of land where they are producing goods. By 1900, the United States has the third largest navy in the world, so we're really starting to see people take the influence of sea power upon history seriously. Secretary of State, a man named James Blaine, will gather a Pan-American conference. So essentially, he will invite representatives from nations in Central and South America, and he will say we need to sort of establish some trade rules that are good for everyone. There's very limited success at this first Pan-American conference, but it lays the groundwork for what is to come. In 1853, Commodore Matthew Perry will sail to Japan and negotiate, not negates, oh my goodness, that's a big typo, negotiate this Treaty of Amity and Commerce, essentially forcing the Japanese to trade with the United States. They call this the opening of Japan. And in Hawaii, American owners of sugar plantations begin to exert increasing amounts of political and economic influence. So Hawaii is a classic example of this economic colonization that I mentioned earlier, right? That at first it's just that they're heavily economically invested, and then they feel the need to protect that economic advancement through increasing political and military control. I mentioned this question a minute ago. As you look at this map, consider the strategic importance of Hawaii and of other Pacific islands. All right, so let's talk about Hawaii. Let me go back here. Hawaii's not smack dab in the middle of the Pacific Ocean for sure, but it is an important stopover. If the United States wants to make it to Asia, they need places to refuel, so Hawaii serves that purpose. We know that eventually there will be a very important strategic naval base there known as Pearl Harbor. Hawaii is also going to be home to a lot of very wealthy Americans, sugar plantation owners, and so they will call upon the U.S. government to incorporate Hawaii as a state. So it's one of the reasons why, because there's a significant American population already living there, that's one of the reasons why Hawaii becomes a state when a lot of these other places don't. Like, for example, Puerto Rico stays a U.S. possession but doesn't become a U.S. state. So let's start on the left. King Kamehameha, there he is. This is King Kamehameha. He will come to power in 1810. There will be several King Kamehamehas. He initially will welcome American traders. They bring money, right? They are helping the economic life of the islands, and there's no reason in the minds of the Hawaiians not to welcome the American traders. Missionaries will follow these early American traders. More Americans will move to Hawaii, and those Americans will establish sugar plantations. This increasing American presence will ultimately have a devastating effect on the economy and society of Hawaii, as the traditional Hawaiian economy and traditional Hawaiian society are replaced gradually and all at once, right? Replaced by a much more Americanized style of economy and society. There will even be an American appointed as prime minister under King Kamehameha III. So as the Hawaiian government is encouraged to become a Western-style monarchy. So we're still having a king. Eventually, I mentioned we'll have a queen, but life is slowly changing in Hawaii. In 1875, Hawaiian sugar is allowed to enter the United States without a tariff. So if a tariff is a charge or a tax on imported goods from foreign nations, then I guess Hawaii isn't a foreign nation as of 1875, at least not in terms of a tariff. In 1887, a treaty is negotiated for the American purchase of Pearl Harbor. In 1890, the tariff exemption is lifted, and it will have devastating effects for the Hawaiian economy. And so here's what we know. If then Hawaii will all of a sudden be charged a tariff for its goods, and the economic life of Hawaii crashes, then Hawaii, and specifically the American plantation owners living in Hawaii, have to find a way to make sure that the tariff exemption stays in place. In 1891, a queen, this is Pearl Harbor, I have to put that up. Queen Liliuokalani, I'm so bad at pronouncing that. She will come to power, and she will start to it has long been recognized by the royal family in Hawaii that this American encroachment is having devastating effects on Hawaiian society. So she will start to limit power and influence of the Americans. But it's too late, honestly, because the Americans are already so economically invested that there's no way that these limitations are going to be acceptable in any way. Because if you start to limit American influence, you're going to start to limit American profits, and Americans don't like that. Excuse me. In 1893, planters lead a revolt against the Queen, and Hawaii will be annexed as a territory in American control in 1898. It will officially become a state in 1959. Okay, Cuba. Actually, I'm going to pause here and I'll make a separate video starting with Cuba.